for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR FM 89.
Hello again, everyone, and thanks very much for being with us. Her administration is 2 weeks old now, and the major pieces of Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders' legislative program, reshaping education, reworking the criminal justice system, revising the tax code, they're still essentially conceptual. That doesn't mean Ms. Sanders can't continue to campaign for them, education in particular. At one point this week, she appeared before a sort of pep rally of students from non-traditional classrooms.
All right, so here we go. We're going to do 1, 2, 3. We're going to give a big woo and wave your scarf. Here we go. 1, 2, 3.
We're focusing on the Arkansas Learns Initiative. We will be rolling out legislation on that initiative here in the coming weeks, but it's something I talked a lot about during the campaign. The Arkansas Learns Initiative focuses on a handful of key areas. Literacy. We have to make sure that we are putting a better foundation underneath our students so that they have a pathway to success. Right now, our system is failing too many of our students, and it's simply unacceptable. At the end of the day, we have to make sure that we are never trapping students in a lifetime of poverty, and that we are not sentencing them to a lifetime of poverty because of where they live or how much money their parents make, what zip code they're in. We will not trap students in failing schools in this state any longer. We will give parents the right to choose the best path for their child.
In a few moments, more on the new administration and these first days of the legislative session from 3 reporters on the Capitol beat. First, though, a couple of lawmakers with close ties to the Sanders administration and who are helping shape its program. Representative Jimmy Gazaway of Paragould and Senator Ben Gilmore of Crossett. Gentlemen, thanks very much for coming in. You are deeply involved in another issue, but we use that soundbite up top. There was a bit of method to our madness. There is going to be a great deal of competition for dollars. There always is in this session. But that budget surplus is sitting there like a Thanksgiving turkey. And a lot of people are going to want a piece of it, and Ms. Sanders has some plans for it too. When are we going to see a program, an education program? When are we going to get to take a look at that? Do you have some insights that you'd share? Mr. Gazaway?
So my understanding is that the education bill is in the works. My understanding is that they're meeting with all the stakeholders and trying to come to some consensus there. I think it's being drafted at the Bureau, and so once the language is prepared, hopefully within the next couple of weeks, we'll see something. But as you know, Senator Gilmore and I have been more focused on the criminal justice legislation, and so you know, there are other folks who probably have greater insight to that than I do. Well,
I'll try with Mr. Gilmore before we go to criminal justice. Even the parameters of it, can you give us a clue?
Well, look, I think the governor's made very clear, Steve, where her focus is with education. And to Representative Gazaway's point, that's still being worked through. I'd be hesitant to speculate on what all is going to be in that package because I haven't seen the education package yet. I know they're working through it with stakeholders. I trust they're being very thorough with that. So look forward to seeing it in the coming weeks.
One more question on that. Both of you represent districts that are parts of the state that has substantial numbers of rural districts, or you're close to rural districts. Anyway, are you picking up some suspicion or some apprehension among your superintendents, school boards, teachers, faculty about what the governor intends to do?
Well,
Senator?
Certainly they're following very closely, and I actually was talking to a superintendent this morning. I was talking to one last night even, and they certainly have their priorities they're focused on. There's things they want to see in this bill.
They don't want to get hurt.
Well, of course, they always want to try to make sure that whatever comes doesn't have any sort of unintended consequences. And I think, again, from what I'm hearing, I'm not on the education committee, right. So I would defer to those who are, but what I'm hearing is they're being very intentional and very thorough in trying to vet out a lot of this policy.
Yeah, Mr. Gazaway, I'll give you the final word on that before we go to something else.
Sure. So obviously, I mean, I think superintendents of any public school district have a important role to play in this discussion. My understanding is that the administration has been very intentional about keeping them informed and involved in that discussion. In my district, I have Greene County Tech and Paragould School District, two fairly large public school districts, and so my understanding is that they're attuned to what's going on and involved in those discussions. So,
on to criminal justice, your specialties, if you will. One thing that seems obvious about the governor's program or any other program that's pending before the General Assembly that is going to get serious consideration, and that is that the state is getting ready to have to spend a great deal more money than it is now on the criminal justice and the correctional system. Mr. Gazaway, how much more?
Well, I think that remains to be seen. I mean, it's like with any other piece of legislation, what can you build consensus around? I think that's, kind of where we are. We have to weigh, what we need in terms of criminal justice reform in light of the money that may be spent on education, the money that may be spent on other priorities that exist. And so, I don't know exactly what we're willing to devote. Those are the ongoing discussions that we're having. That's, people ask sometimes, why haven't we seen a bill yet? What are we waiting on? Well, part of it is, we have to determine among our priorities how much can we devote to criminal justice in light of what we're devoting to other priorities. So I can't give you a number right now. I mean, I expect that it will be several $100 million, but, again, ultimately that'll be what we can build consensus on.
Well, building consensus is inevitably going to come down to building space for more beds. We've got 500 coming at Calico Rock. ADC is looking for a place to build another 1,000. How many more beyond that do you gentlemen have a figure in mind? What's likely to emerge?
Yeah, there's a lot of figures that have been thrown out. We do know that there's a capacity issue, right? And we understand that there is an issue with the backup in our county facilities that needs to be addressed. I would like to touch real quick on the question that you asked Representative Gazaway,
Sure.
and that is the cost. And I would argue back, what's the cost if we don't spend the money that's needed to address the acute crisis, violent crime that's sweeping our state? And so I think we have to be very intentional when we're looking at that we consider the negative externalities of not addressing our county backup issue, of not locking away violent offenders where they need to be, and that's in prison, away from our communities and our families that we want to keep safe. So I think all of that has to be factored into the equation of what is the cost.
Mr. Gazaway.
Well, so realistically, and to follow on Senator Gilmore's point, look, we have about 2,000 people who are in county jails who are awaiting a bed in the ADC that we simply don't have. So if you look at eliminating that backlog alone, you're talking about 2,000 folks. Then you're going to have natural growth that's going to occur. Of course, we have a consultant who projects kind of what the natural growth will be among the prison population, so you have that to account for. And then we're looking at reforming our broken parole system, because we have a broken parole system in this state. We're not keeping the people, the violent offenders who we need to be keeping in prison. People are only serving a fraction of their time. And so if we reform our broken parole system, then that also adds, to the capacity issue. So, realistically, I would say a minimum of 3,000 beds, could be as many as 5. I think you heard Attorney General Griffin say that the other day in an interview. Possibly even up to 5,000 beds is the need.
We are spending, if I have the numbers of the last time I checked anyway, I think for the current FY we're doing between more than $600 million, I think, for community corrections and for the Department of Correction. We're edging toward $1 billion, are we not?
Well, look, again,
not edging, we're taking big steps toward it.
Well, look, again, it is expensive, right?
Yeah.
But it's very expensive to keep our community safe, which I think should be our #1 priority. I think also we have to look at the fact that it's a little bit inconsiderate and disrespectful to law enforcement if we don't address these problems and make them go back and catch the same people over and over and over again. So there's those things that have to weigh into that equation of the cost. But to Representative Gazaway's point, we have things that we have to fix within the system. The parole system is broken. We have a revolving door. Anybody within the corrections system can tell you that. And so if we don't fix that, the costs are going to continue to edge up. And so and when I say edge up, vastly more so than what we're dealing with now.
We seem always, gentlemen, to have a backlog at the county at the county level of anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000, as you mentioned. Are we doing something wrong? And yet we keep building beds, or have over the years. Are we doing something wrong?
Well, I think the issue is that it really has been ignored for several decades. Yes, we've built beds in terms of community corrections, which are for nonviolent offenders. But if you listen to the folks at the Department of Corrections, Solomon Graves, for instance, testified in a recent hearing last year that what's driving the prison population are seriousness level 8, 9, and 10 offenses. These are violent offenses. These are the sexual offenses. And the type of beds that we need, and this is, again, Secretary Graves last year, are maximum security beds. The types of prison facilities that we have, the communal housing and that sort of thing, doesn't address the need that we have in our state for more maximum security beds for the violent offenders. And so I think that's what we're looking at. Why we need to build more beds is to address those particular types of offenders.
Could this be addressed? To what extent could the situation be addressed by changes to the sentencing grid? Is that under consideration? To what extent is that under consideration?
Well, look, what I think we have to address, first of all, we have to address the capacity issue. And with that, we have to find a way to keep the repeat violent offender locked away. And I don't think there has to be a ton of changes to the sentencing grid to do that. I think that what we need to do is we need to see some truth in sentencing. We need people to understand that when they commit a violent crime in the state of Arkansas, that they're going to be in prison for serious time, and they're going to do almost all of that time. I don't think that's too much to ask for. When someone is committing a serious, heinous crime, they need to do serious time with that.
Mr. Gazaway, you're a former prosecutor. Go ahead. We've got a little bit less than a minute remaining. You've got it.
Well, I want to make something very clear. I think the purpose of our legislation is, look, no one wants to imprison nonviolent offenders or drug addicts. Like, that is not the purpose of this legislation. What we have to do is make sure that we keep our communities safe by having sufficient capacity to incapacitate or lock up those violent offenders who are preying on our communities and the sexual predators, child sexual offenders. We have to have sufficient capacity to address those issues. But in terms of the nonviolent offenders, look, I don't think that it serves communities, that it serves families, that it serves the taxpayer to keep people locked up who are nonviolent, who may just be drug addicts. The purpose there would be to divert them from ever entering the prison population, and the focus there should be on rehabilitation. And so that's what we're seeking to do with this legislation.
Got to end it there. Gentlemen, thanks very much. Representative Gazaway, Senator Gilmore, thank you very much for coming in. Please come back.
We'll do it.
Hopefully as soon as the legislation's cooked.
Sure.
Sounds good.
We'll be right back. Back now with more on the session from three pairs of eyes watching it fairly closely. Andrew DeMillo, Capitol Bureau Chief of the Associated Press, Steve Brawner, independent journalist, and Josie Lenora, politics and government reporter from KUAR Public Radio in Central Arkansas. Thanks to everybody for coming in. Andrew, we'll bring you in from afar. We're 2 weeks into the administration now, 2 weeks into the session, and everything is still pretty thematic. We don't know what we don't know, really, about the administration's program.
Yeah, that's correct. We're kind of in a holding pattern. Everyone heading into the session had said the three big issues were going to be education, criminal justice, and tax cuts. And we have yet to see pieces of legislation on any of those three topics. Obviously, tax cuts is something we're expecting to come at the tail end of the session. But education reform, which is the issue that Governor Sanders has said is her priority, we're still possibly a couple weeks away from seeing legislation on that. We know she's talked in kind of broad strokes about what she wants to do. There's going to be some element of school choice in there. There's going to be some kind of teacher raise in there, stuff dealing with literacy programs as well too. But a lot of the specifics and a lot of the numbers we still don't know about, and that's kind of keeping legislators in a holding pattern on a lot of the other issues right now.
Well, we may not have the specifics on criminal justice, but we do know some of the numbers. At a bare minimum, we know, guys, we're getting ready to spend a lot more money on the Department of Correction. Josie?
Yeah, the Lieutenant Governor, Tim Griffin, has talked about how he wants to increase sentences for those who've been convicted of violent crimes so that people would spend more time in prison for their sentencing. But again, that's kind of all we know right now.
Yeah. It's going to cost money, though. In addition to capital expenditures, which seem imminent, Steve, M&O on those prisons is going to go up.
Yeah, and once you have a prison, you kind of got to fill it. But that's not going to be a problem right now. As Attorney General Griffin has said, basically our prisons are full and they're running over into the county jails, which are also full. So we're kind of in a crisis situation. So even if legislators might have different ideas about how you need to address crime, reduce the population, at this point you've got to do something. You've got to, and so we have a surplus, we have a need, so we're going to build some prisons.
And you build a prison and you pay for it over and over and over again because you use it.
Right, we have a surplus right now.
Right now.
Will we have a surplus in the future? But again, as General Griffin has pointed out, the bad guys are getting let out really early, and the ones in misdemeanor offenders aren't even going to jail at all, because there just is no space. So we're building a prison. Yeah,
Andrew DeMillo, on back to education for just a second. It's always been implied, I think, in earlier discussion, during the campaign anyway, that parochial schools might well in Arkansas pick up some public dollars. The administration, the governor, is now using the word openly, which surprises a little people. Or surprises people a little, not a whole lot maybe, but a little anyway.
Yeah, and that's one of the areas that we're still waiting details on. She's talked just generally about school choice. I think the term that she's used is parental empowerment, but we don't really know what exactly does that mean. Is that going to be a straight up voucher program? Are we talking scholarships? Are we talking some kind of savings accounts? There's different forms that this could take, and that's going to be, the details we're waiting to see. And one of the issues that's going to come up on that is how do they deal with potentially some opposition from some rural Republicans to a school choice element of this legislation. Obviously, you're not going to get support from Democrats who have actually presented their own education legislation this week, taking advantage of the fact that there's this vacuum right now on details on the education legislation. But is this something where they can still get through some resistance that they may face within their own party on it?
Yeah, Josie, do we have a sense yet of how much resistance?
I was at her school choice rally this week where she had all the children chant "Students, not systems," and she sort of regurgitated these lines she likes, like no child should be caught in a failing education system because of the size of their bank account. A lot of Democrats don't love, things like a school voucher program because it takes money from public schools and funnels it into private schools. And there's also a lot of backlash about those schools don't necessarily have to be accredited. So this week, Representative Wooster from BB put forth two bills, one that would make it so there has to be public transportation to private schools that receive public dollars, and another one that would make it so these schools have to face certain accreditation requirements.
Some monitoring anyway, state monitoring of private school. Steve?
Yeah, I think, the fact that we haven't seen the bill yet is pretty good evidence that there's a lot of pushback. Mm-hmm. If it was unanimous agreement, then we would have already seen it at this point, even though it's going to be a pretty massive change. So I think that we can gather that. As you said, Representative Wooten, he's a Republican. And yet he's basically, by filing those two bills, was making the argument against vouchers, which is that private schools have not had to do the same things that public schools do, which is educate everybody, transport them, educate the hard students, not be exclusive. That's what he was doing. That's that argument. That's what we'll see, and that's why we haven't seen the bill yet.
Yeah, and this is not a new position for Mr. Wooten. He has argued in sessions previous that any encroachment on the public school fund is inevitably, or any expansion anyway of vouchers, is inevitably, in his estimation, going to damage the public school fund.
And there are Republicans across the state who are going to agree with that. So we'll see. This is going to be the big issue. Look, we had a governor elected with 63% of the vote. It's her first term. It is unthinkable that she's going to lose completely on this issue. She will get a big part of what she wants. It just depends on on what is proposed and what the debate boils down to. But we're going to have something pretty significant because it's her signature issue and she cannot fail, and they won't let her fail.
Well, chemically speaking, ideologically speaking, Josie, it would seem to be a General Assembly that is rather in tune with the governor. She hasn't done any, I can't recall her saying anything in the 2 weeks, or for that matter during the campaign, that would put her substantially at odds with the Republican majority in either chamber.
I haven't seen a lot of pushback to any of her policies, and within that education bill, she's talked a lot about raising teacher salaries and then having more of a phonics curriculum as opposed to a whole reading curriculum, and I haven't seen any pushback or any disagreement with some of those policies.
Andrew, as Steve mentioned just a second ago, there was a Democrat, or one of our panelists mentioned, there was a Democratic alternative, or a Democratic bill for teacher pay introduced this week. I would put my money on whatever the administration proposes.
Yeah, I think so. This is something that was signed on by all the Democrats in the House and Senate. But this is a predominantly Republican legislature, and I don't really know that this is going to get that far. But they're at least taking advantage of the fact that there's an opportunity to at least put attention on their proposal and on their issues right now. But I think the focus is going to be on whatever the teacher raise element is in her legislation. And also the other big question is there going to be some kind of merit pay or performance incentives type plan in this legislation? Yeah.
One of the things that strike just 2 weeks into the session, and that is the sharp, predictable at one level, Josie, that Steve, that's the sharp ideological divide now between the parties. You have Republican supermajorities in both chambers, but there seems to be a great cohesion on the part of both. Democrats just don't have muscle to do much. Steve, Josie?
Well, there's basically 80% of the legislature is Republican. All the constitutional officers are Republican. This is a Republican state, so where Democrats have some leverage is if they can form coalitions with enough Republicans who will be opposed to certain elements of what the governor's trying to do, and then they can sneak some things through. Representative Flowers has an interesting bill that would allow felons to regain their ability to have a gun. And that's a kind of a interesting pro-gun legislation by a Democrat, and it's got a good chance of going through. So that's how a Democrat can get something through if they play their cards right, pick the right issue, get the right allies, and do what they need to do. It can happen, and in that case, it probably will.
Yeah, Josie?
I just feel like in all my conversations with the Democrats and all the interviews I've seen with them, they do kind of fall back on this rhetoric of we're going to focus on what unites us and what not divides us. We're going to focus on issues that we can all agree on, which is why I think even within this education debate, they keep talking about teacher pay and phonics and things that have wide support.
But keep in mind also that while Republicans might appear to be unified on the surface at times, there is going to be some pretty major differences issue by issue and overall. And so in some ways, it would be easier for them if they were 67 instead of over 80 in the House. And, that major majority almost makes things more complicated for them at times.
There does seem to, the executive and the legislative, certainly the legislative majority, seem to be in lockstep on this, Andrew DeMillo. And that's at times not so gentle repudiation of Ms. Sanders' Republican predecessor.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think we're seeing, some of the pushback that you saw in the final years of Governor Hutchinson's administration from fellow Republicans, I think is boiled over even to this session now, which we've seen with some of his appointments being rejected. And we're also seeing that with Governor Sanders rolling back some of his positions and some of his initiatives. She had dissolved some of his panels that he had formed addressing COVID. She's reversed his position, opposing a judge's ruling that struck down the ban on mask mandates by government entities. I think this is kind of an indication that she's going in another direction, and also the legislature kind of still indicating some of their displeasure with some of his stances.
Yeah, it's a General Assembly that's moving, and an administration that's moving to the right.
Well, the Republican Party has moved to the right. The culture has become more split. And then also keep in mind, too, Governor Hutchinson was there for 8 years. You had the whole COVID thing, which was divisive for a lot of people. Not necessarily what he did, but I'm just saying that was a divisive time. He was part of it. And then he was there for 8 years. Probably in Governor Sanders' 8 years.
Incumbent fatigue,
eighth year,
yeah.
There will be issues with her from some people if she stays that long.
Yeah, sure. Josie, what are we looking for in the next 5 days?
What are we looking for the next 5 days? I'm interested to see if we do get the education bill anytime soon, but I haven't seen any indicators.
Do we have any kind of timeline at all, any signals at all, Steve, from the administration?
Speaker Shepard and Governor Sanders were talking about a couple of weeks. Representative Brian Evans, who's the chair of the House Education Committee, told me Wednesday, maybe by the end of this week, but that was in terms of possibility. So it's going to happen in the next couple of weeks, but we'll see.
All right. Steve, you get Andrew, you get the last word. What your projections for the coming week?
Yeah, I think the thing to watch is going to be social issues. We're going to see dominating the session right now, like we saw at the beginning of the session a couple years ago. We're going to see likely final action next week on a bill that puts restrictions on drag shows, which could put Arkansas as the first state to make such restrictions. We have a bathroom bill that's going before committee. And I would not be surprised to see movement on other kind of culture wars types issues coming up in the next week.
And a lot of them. All right, that does it for us. Gents and Lady, thanks for coming in. As always, thank you for watching. See you next week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR FM 89.